Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah,
Okay, so you've shared some really insightful excerpts with us from a podcast called The Beauty of Islam, A Journey of Faith.
that's right.
And what we're going to do today is, well, pull back the layers on those excerpts and get right to the heart of the fundamental tenets and principles of Islam as they were presented.
Mm-hmm.
Think of this as your uh, express route, maybe. A shortcut to grasping some key aspects of Islam without having to, listen to the whole thing yourself. We've sort of sifted through it for you.
Exactly. And this Beauty of Islam podcast, it sets out to explore the teachings, the history, and the underlying wisdom within the Islamic tradition.
Okay.
So in our time together, we'll be focusing on understanding what Islam is at its core. It's, strong emphasis on peace and compassion.
Right.
Some of the practical lessons it offers that are still so relevant today, and also touching on some of those frequently asked questions that often come up.
Sounds good. Okay, let's dive in then. So where did the podcast actually begin in its exploration of Islam? What was the starting point?
It started right at the beginning with the definition of Islam itself, explaining that it's, maybe more than just a religion in the way we often think about that term. How did you find its framing of that?
Well, the first thing that really jumped out at me was the meaning of Islam itself, submission, specifically submission to the will of Allah.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't just presented as like a set of doctrines. It really came across as a complete way of life.
Mm-hmm.
That felt like a really significant starting point. Yeah.
It absolutely is. And this idea, this concept of a holistic way of life, it really filters into, every aspect of a Muslim's existence,
That's so.
from their spiritual practices, their rituals, to how they interact with their communities and the wider world. And from that sort of foundational idea, the podcast moved pretty naturally into the, let's say, structural pillars of this way of life.
Right. The 5 pillars of Islam. Yeah, we heard about Shahada, which is the declaration of
The
faith.
core belief, yes.
Then Salah, the 5 daily prayers. Zakat, the principle of charitable giving. Psalm, fasting, especially during Ramadan. And then Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca for those who are able.
Exactly.
What I found interesting was how the podcast really stressed that these aren't just like empty rituals,
No, not at all.
but they actively shape a Muslim's daily life.
Yeah.
And really define their personal connection with their creator, with Allah.
Precisely. These pillars, they provide a practical framework, a framework for both devotion and, righteous living. They're the fundamental building blocks, really, of a Muslim's faith and practice.
Okay.
And what underpins all of this, according to the podcast, is the Holy Quran.
Yes, the Quran. It was described as the final message from Allah, revealed to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. It's presented as the ultimate guide for living a life marked by, righteousness, justice, and peace. So it sounds like the Quran is the central text, the anchor for understanding this whole way of life.
Absolutely. It's considered the ultimate source of divine guidance for Muslims in, pretty much all aspects of their lives.
Right.
Now, having sort of laid that foundation, the podcast then turned its attention to a really critical aspect, especially given, some of the common misunderstandings about Islam.
Right.
What stood out to you about how it handled the concepts of peace and compassion?
Oh, this was definitely a key area for me. The podcast directly took on that common misconception head on and really emphasized that Islam, at its core, is rooted in peace.
Yeah, that's vital.
It even pointed out the significance of the common Muslim greeting, Assalamu Alaikum, which, as we know, means peace be upon you.
Right.
It's such a simple greeting, but it carries a really profound message, doesn't it?
It really does. It constantly reinforces that intrinsic value of peace within the Islamic tradition. And furthermore, the podcast highlighted a specific verse from the Quran that I think is particularly illuminating here.
Which one was that?
And we have not sent you, O Muhammad, except as a mercy to the worlds. When you think about that, being described as a mercy to all of creation, it really speaks volumes, I think, about the foundational principles.
That verse really stuck with me, too. It gives such a powerful lens, to understand the prophet's role and the overall message.
Mm-hmm.
And then to sort of bring those principles to life, the podcast shared that that really touching story about Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the elderly woman.
The one who threw garbage at him. Yes.
That one.
What's so compelling about that story, I think, is how beautifully it illustrates those principles, compassion, patience, forgiveness, that are so central to Islamic teachings.
Totally.
Instead of reacting with anger or, seeking payback, the Prophet's act of kindness, visiting her when she fell ill, It truly exemplifies putting those high ideals into actual practice.
It makes the teachings feel incredibly human and relatable, doesn't it?
Absolutely, it does.
It's one thing to talk about these abstract ideas like peace and compassion, but seeing them shown like that in such a personal way makes them so much more meaningful. So, shifting gears just a bit, the podcast then moved on to explore the practical lessons that Islam offers, especially for navigating, well, the complexities of our modern world.
Right, the relevance today.
Yeah. What were some of the key practices and their relevance that were highlighted there?
Well, several of the daily Islamic practices were presented as holding this kind of timeless wisdom that's still incredibly relevant. The 5 daily prayers, Salah, for instance.
Okay.
They were described as a way to instill discipline and cultivate mindfulness.
Mindfulness. Interesting.
Yeah, that connection between a spiritual act and its sort of tangible benefits for mental focus and inner peace. It's quite profound when you think about it.
Definitely. It suggests it's not just about, going through the motions of a ritual,
Not at all.
but about the deeper impact it has on your inner state and overall well-being. And then there's zakat, the concept of obligatory charity.
Ah, yes, zakat.
The podcast framed that in terms of ensuring social welfare and economic justice within the community. It's like a system built right into the faith to support those in need.
Exactly. It really underscores the strong emphasis on communal responsibility and, the interconnectedness of people within society.
Right.
And Psalm, the fasting during Ramadan, was explained not just as physical abstinence, but also as a practice to develop greater self-control, empathy for those less fortunate, and a deeper spiritual awareness.
That makes sense. Experiencing hunger and thirst, even temporarily.
Yeah, it can foster a pretty profound understanding of what others might be going through.
Right. It's about so much more than just not eating or drinking. It sounds like a period of intense self-reflection and cultivating inner virtues.
That's a good way to put it.
The podcast also directly addressed the importance of mental and emotional well-being within the Islamic framework, didn't it?
Yes, it did. It referenced that powerful Quranic verse, "Verily, in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find rest." This idea that finding a connection with something, greater than oneself can bring about profound inner peace and tranquility. That's a message that resonates pretty universally, I think, regardless of specific beliefs.
Yeah, definitely. And it then introduced the practice of dhikr
Dhikr, yes, the remembrance of Allah.
as a practical and accessible way to actually cultivate that inner peace. It sounds almost like a form of mindfulness or meditation, but deeply rooted in the Islamic spiritual tradition.
Precisely. It's a way to quiet the often turbulent mind and find solace and strength through that spiritual connection.
Okay.
Now, the final major area the podcast tackled was directly addressing some of the common questions and, unfortunately, some persistent misconceptions that many people have about Islam.
Right, the difficult questions.
Yeah. What were some of the key areas where it sought to provide clarity?
Well, it directly confronted the issue of violence, which sadly comes up so often in discussions about Islam.
Unfortunately, yes.
The podcast stated very clearly, unequivocally, that Islam condemns injustice and actively promotes peace. It offered a very direct, unambiguous answer to a question that's often just filled with misunderstanding.
Which is absolutely crucial, isn't it? It's so vital to make that clear distinction between the actions of maybe certain individuals or groups and the core foundational tenets of the faith itself.
Definitely.
Yeah.
The podcast also addressed the reasons why many Muslim women choose to wear the hijab.
Ah, the hijab. Yes.
Yes, and it framed it as a personal expression of faith, a commitment to modesty, and actually a source of empowerment for many women.
Empowerment.
And it explicitly stated that it is not a symbol of oppression, as it's sometimes portrayed. That's a really important perspective to share because it directly challenges a lot of the negative narratives that are out there.
Absolutely. The autonomy and personal agency of the women who choose to wear the hijab are often just completely overlooked in broader discussions.
Yeah.
Finally, the podcast touched upon the concept of jihad.
Jihad, right. And it clarified that the primary meaning of jihad is that internal struggle.
The inner struggle, yeah.
Against one's own base desires and weaknesses. That inner battle for self-improvement and spiritual growth. This focus on the internal dimension seems to be the core understanding, rather than the external conflict that's so often associated with in popular discourse.
That focus on the internal, that spiritual struggle, is just a fundamental aspect of Islamic ethics.
Okay.
So, as we've kind of walked through these excerpts from The Beauty of Islam, what would you say are the most significant insights you've taken away?
Good question.